Good morning. It is a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to Pfizer for sponsoring this breakfast and to ALEC for sponsoring the book that Arthur and I did together. It's been really a thrill for me to write two books in this last year with Arthur Laffer. We wrote The Rich States, Poor States, and then we wrote a book called The End of Prosperity, which is cheerfully titled. And, you know, just writing with Arthur has been a real personal thrill for me. I was reading Arthur Laffer's stuff when I was 5 years old, so he's been a great, by the way, he wasn't just on Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, he was also a very close personal advisor to Calvin Coolidge. He is the great-grandfather of supply-side economics. Before I talk a few minutes about the economy, I wanted to just tell you, that's just a dour subject, I wanted to tell you one kind of fun story, which is that at the how many of you read the Wall Street Journal editorial page pretty regularly? Thank you for doing that. Thank you for helping pay our bills. One of the things we've done that's new at the Journal is every week we do a long feature on our Saturday paper with some famous person. And so, you know, I've done long interviews with everyone from Fred Smith at Federal Express to Charles Schwab to John McCain and so on. But about 2 months ago, I had the privilege of interviewing one of the most interesting people I've ever met in my life, a guy who has nothing to do with politics or the economy, somebody by the name of Art Linkletter. How many of you remember who Art Linkletter was? I'm pleased to report that he is 96 years old. He's been married to the same woman for 70 years. He's a conservative. He's a free market conservative, and he is the most interesting person I have ever met in my life. He was, you know, one of these people who actually was one of the few people who made the transition from radio to TV. He knew everybody in the golden age of Hollywood. I mean, he knew Jack Benny, he knew Walt Disney, he knew Ron and Nancy Reagan, you know, he knew Groucho Marx, everybody. He has incredible stories. And this, you know, as you know, one of his shows that he did was the Kids Say the Darndest Things and so on. And so one thing he told me in our interview, I've just got to relate to you because it's one of the funniest stories I've ever heard. And again, it has nothing to do with politics, but you know, Art is now 96 years old, and last year he had a stroke. I said, my God, Art, what was that like? And he said, well, you know, Steve, I was sitting on the couch watching TV, and all of a sudden I felt a little tingling in my right toes. And then he said a few minutes after that, I felt some, I was losing feeling in my right arm. And after a few minutes after that, I felt like I was almost feeling paralysis all over the right side of my body. And I'm like, oh my God, Art, what did you do? And he turned to me and he said, well, the first thing I did, Steve, is I moved my pecker to the left side of my body, which from a 97-year-old man is a pretty funny thing to say. I was giving this presentation. Rich Vedder, that should be some advice to you out there. But I was giving this story. I was telling this story to a group a couple weeks ago at a Republican women's organization, and this little old lady in the front row says to me, "I didn't know you could do that." Anyways, all right. Now I'm going to get serious. I'm going to talk about the economy. Here is my premise. I believe that everything that we have done in Washington in the last 6 months, virtually every single policy move and maneuver that has been made to deal with this recession, everything that has been done has been exactly the wrong thing to do. We have done every possible wrong decision. And unfortunately, folks, it is getting worse. You've all been following what's been happening in the last couple of weeks. I believe that the way I put it, and this is the first, I'm normally an optimistic person. Arthur is even more optimistic than I am normally. But the two bills that we now confront, cap and tax, or sometimes I call it crap and tax, and the health care bill, these are the greatest single threats to freedom and liberty that we've seen in our lifetime. And the barbarians are at the gates right now. And I really believe that the next 10 weeks or so is going to determine whether the United States is going to still be the country that we love. And so this is a critical period for all of you as state legislators to contact your senators and congressmen and tell them how critical this fight is. I mean, cap and trade is probably the single worst bill I've seen in 30 years. It is 1,100 pages long. It is a central planner's dream come true. It will regulate every single facet of our economy, everything from what you set your thermostat in your house, whether you will need an EPA permit to take the air conditioning unit out of your home. I mean, this is an incredibly intrusive piece of legislation that will cripple our economy. I call it the China and India Development Act, because we will see massive amounts of businesses move out of the United States to other countries. The health care bill is almost as bad. And how many of you saw what Charlie Rangel did this week with his markup of this bill? This is going to destroy America's small business sector. They're talking about an 8% payroll tax surcharge. So that would mean that the payroll tax for every employee in a business that doesn't provide health care for their workers would go from 15% to 23%. We're talking about European levels of taxation here. The income tax rate would go from 35% today. Then they repeal the Bush tax cuts, which brings it to over 40%, and then there's a 5.4% surtax on top of that. So the highest income tax rate would go to somewhere in the neighborhood of 46%. And for those of you who are lucky to live in states like New York and California and New Jersey, the combined federal and state income tax in the United States would be as high as 58%. I mean, we're getting perilously close to those golden days of the 1970s. And so I wanted to show you a few pictures, if I could. Could you please put up the presentation? And some of you have seen this stuff. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but I think it is really important in terms of understanding where our economy is today and why your job as state legislators is so critical in combating the tax and spend mentality that's going on in Washington. First of all, if you look at this, and many of you have probably seen this if you've seen me speak before, but this is the heart of what the book, The End of Prosperity, is about. You can see very quickly that the black line, by the way, is the S&P 500. The blue line is the S&P 500. All we've done here is inflation adjusted the numbers. These come out of Arthur Laffer's firm. And what we find is that you can see this very clearly, the V shape of this graph. In the late 60s and through the 1970s, we had the worst period of the economy that we've ever seen. In fact, the real value of stocks over that period from 1968 to 1982 fell by 52% when adjusted for inflation. One of the things, by the way, that annoys me to no end, you've all heard this 100 times. Everyone in the media says it day after day, that Barack Obama inherited the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, right? You've all heard that 1,000 times. It isn't even close to being the truth. What Ronald Reagan inherited was much worse than what Barack Obama has inherited, and I'm not saying that we're not in an economic crisis today, we are, but what Barack Obama has inherited is a 9-month crisis. What Ronald Reagan inherited was a 15-year crisis. The important point is you can see what happens when we put in place pro-growth, limited government, supply-side economics policies that were authored by people like Jack Kemp and people like obviously Ronald Reagan and of course Arthur Laffer. Look at what happens to the direction of that curve. I mean, if you want to see how ideas matter, we saw the greatest economic boom in the history of the world after Reaganomics was put in place. From 1981 to 2007, the United States, the value of all U.S. assets, adjusted for inflation, went from $16 trillion to $56 trillion. No country in the history of the world has ever seen anything like what happened in the United States over that period. It happened under Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and then in the first 6 years of the Bush administration. And the real question we ask ourselves now, as we see, you can see at the tail end of this chart that the crisis happens, and this is about 2 or 3 months out of date, so the stock market has fallen a lot more even since then. The real question we have to ask ourselves, is this just going to be a temporary pause, or are we going to boom out of this recession, or are we in the early stages of a long period of stagflation like we were in the 1970s? And I would have to say, if we continue on the path that we are right now, it's certainly looking to me like not a very pretty picture.